Welcome back to James Cameron 101. I am your host, Eddie Green, and today we are sitting down and talking with the director of Sanctum.
Here is James Cameron.
You never really get an opportunity. You take an opportunity. If you're going to do something, you have to do it all the way, and you have to just put it before all other things. I don't know about you, but I'm having a really great time.
So yes, welcome back, everybody. We are talking to Alister Grierson today, the director of Sanctum. Of course, this is the 2011 film that James Cameron helped to bring to the screen as an executive producer, and checked it out last night. I just wanted to make sure I was fresh on it, and really looking forward to this. Alister is joining us all the way from Australia, I believe. So we're gonna bring him in here, and then we're gonna get this conversation off and rocking and rolling. So let's bring in Alister Grierson.
G'day, how are you?
I am good. Did I get that correct? You're still in Australia?
Yeah, very much so. I'm in Queensland, which, if you're familiar with Australia, is northeast coast of Australia, near Brisbane. It's a place called the Gold Coast, where we sort of settled about 5 years ago. I came up to make a movie which ultimately didn't happen here. Someone else made it in New Zealand about 5 years later, which is often the way of the industry. But this is actually where I made Sanctum, at the Village Roadshow Studios, which are here, which have we can go into some talk about this later, but have amazing facilities at the studio, particularly wet facilities, water facilities, which obviously with Sanctum was a huge part of the process. So they have a big tank here, 50 by 70 meters, which is what's that? So that's 210 feet by 150 feet, something like that, and 30 feet deep. So it's a big volume of water, and there's only probably 3 or 4 places in the world with that kind of volume of water to shoot something, and we couldn't get an old nuclear facility to build. I think it was a nuclear facility, wasn't it,
The Abyss?
with the Abyss? that actually became a big part of the. Anyway, we can talk about that. But obviously, Jim's experience doing that guided a lot of the stuff around what we were doing. But anyway, yes, I'm in Queensland. That was a long answer to a short question.
Hey, it's all good. It's all good. I love to always, if I have a new guest on the podcast, I love to start before we get into the why we're here, which is to talk about Sanctum. I love to figure out kind of how this became your career. So as long or short as you want to make this, how did becoming a filmmaker become your career?
That's a good question. I ask myself that quite regularly. I actually studied at university and studied economics and politics and Japanese. And at some point, halfway through the course, I didn't feel like what I was doing was a good, mix for me, or wasn't really what I was about. But something else I was doing simultaneously was doing a lot of stage comedy, sketch-based stuff. And we kind of had a bit of a troupe and modelled ourselves on, the Monty Python guys. And I'd always, even at high school, we'd been very much into that sort of idea, that stuff. And I really loved it. And I think at some point in my early 20s, probably heartbroken from a failed romance, and then it sort of solidified. I lived in Japan for a while after I finished university, and I was just, if you, it was funny listening to that James Cameron intro. It's like, if you're going to do something, you've got to do it, and you've got to go all in and commit to it. And so I just made the decision, okay, I'm going to become a film director. Which was just absurd. I was in Tokyo at the time, and had no background at all in making films. I didn't have a clue how films were made. I literally had never been on a film set. I'd never held a camera. I'd just fallen in love with movies, and had as a kid My dad was a pilot in the Air Force, and so we traveled a lot as a family. And I lived on a RAF base, an Air Force base, as a child for 4 years. And one of the centerpieces of the base and the centerpiece of sort of the entertainment precinct was this classic old movie theater. And it was just a brilliant, it's a strange building right in the middle of this Air Force base, this giant old wooden theater, very old school. And they ran movies. I mean, obviously, I look back on it now and I marvel at it. The guys who ran that would have been airmen, they would have been working Air Force people. I have no idea who they were at all. I mean, I was a child, but they ran movies day and night, 7 days a week. It was extraordinary, and the playlist, the schedule, whatever it's called, was incredible. So you'd have all of the contemporary releases coming out, because now we're talking the 80s, which is sort of, I mean, really peak cinema, I reckon, and that can be another discussion. But you could watch literally a James Cameron movie, and then on the same bill or the next day, there'd be retrospective films, French films, whatever, classics. It was really extraordinary. I don't know how it worked, but that was my kind of education, and I just fell in love with movies. And the 80s, so it was literally James Cameron and John Carpenter, and some great Australian filmmakers at the time, Peter Weir in particular, and George Miller, because we're talking about the original Mad Maxes and, Gallipoli. I mean, those early Peter Weir films. And so I really, that's kind of where I learned the language of cinema, I suppose, learned how to love cinema. And I just decided and then at university, I think probably as a artistically inclined, for want of a better description, person, watching movies and really, I mean, in those days, the VHS era is still, well and truly, because we're talking now, say, I finished university in mid 90s. That sort of the VHS era is in full swing. I think with pre-DVD, and movies like Apocalypse Now are sort of going back to some of these. I mean, I just loved. That's when I really it really kicked for me that cinema was more than just entertainment. There was other possibilities with cinema as a force for sort of social influence or commentary, or that there was more. It was more potent than I'd sort of originally thought of it as a medium. And Apocalypse Now became this huge influence on me, and which is why my first movie was actually a war movie. So I don't think that's a coincidence. Yeah, and then moved back to Australia and just basically immersed myself in it and just started making films, short films, for years and years, and sort of got involved with the film scene in Sydney, and became friends with people like Nash and Joel Edgerton, guy called John Paulson who set up a film festival called Tropfest, a short film festival, and I got involved with that, in very much behind the scenes, and but there was a big sort of emerging short film scene in Sydney at that time, and that was very helpful. But then I kind of gave up on it, to be honest, and thought this is just too much hard work. There's no return, and then sort of started working in just doing some jobs in behind the scenes in television. And I thought I'll have one last sort of throw of the dice, and applied to a film school called the AFTRS, which is the Australian Film, Television and Radio School, which is the big national school in Australia. And it's quite prestigious and very difficult to get into. I mean, really, it's a lottery to get in, but amazingly, I got in. There's only 4, in those days, it's changed now, but in those days, there were 4 directors chosen a year. So it was a very kind of elite institution, and they had a huge budget. So, I mean, my graduation film was a 35mm film that had a $250,000 budget, which for a film school is quite extraordinary, And so it was a real kind of finishing school for me, because I'd already made so many films before I actually went to there. But it was a way to meet people and develop ideas, and that's what we did. So at film school, I came up with my first feature film kind of concept and put a team together, and I was very fortunate. We got this great team. We pitched to some people, got some money together, and went off and made our first film, which was pretty. And I made that the year after I finished film school, and that's how it all kind of started. So that was about 2005. By then, I think that film came out. So it's 20. In fact, it was 2006. So it's a 20-year anniversary that film came out. Yeah, which feels like a long time ago. My son turns 20 this year, so there you go. That's how old my career is, I suppose.
Awesome. Awesome. I love hearing it just because it's so, everyone's story is kind of different. And especially, I don't have too many Australians on the podcast. So I always love to kind of figure out how it's a little different, I guess. But it sounds like it's maybe even the same, like they have schools and whatnot. Do you recommend going to film school, or is it sort of just kind of pick up a camera and do it, kind of thing?
That's a really interesting question, and like everything in life, there's no real answer. I think
Right.
you do what's in front of you. You apply to film school, but don't rely on film school. Go to film school, but don't rely on it. Or not go to film school. And at the end of the day, it's just about making films, and you've got to develop your skills. Until you make a film, you don't really understand what making a film is. Until you've written the script, organized the people, turned up at the location, put the camera in position, turned it on, asked the actors to do something, filmed it, and then gather all that material and edit it together, and look at it and work out what the hell it is that you've done. It's really such a strange process. It's much harder than people think it is. Part of the art of it is creating the illusion that it's always existed in time. That the films that stand up, that hold up, are films that are so seamless in a way that they feel like granite. They've always existed.
Right.
When you think of your favorite films, I mean, think of a James Cameron film. They're so close to sort of flawless. You so very quickly, once the film starts rolling through the gate, so to speak, it just feels like it's always existed in time and space, because it's so kind of perfect, and as a form. So that's the art, and how you kind of get to that place is tricky. Some people are lucky, and maybe, but it's in a lot of ways, overnight success is you usually discover there's a 20-year engine room, to the overnight success, So a James Cameron, I don't actually really, well, I can't remember. I'm sure I probably researched at some stage. I don't really know his background. You can probably inform me. I mean, I know obviously his Roger Corman experience as a younger man, but as a Canadian, what his childhood was like, or any of that sort of stuff, or what he did as a kid. I'm sure he was a film nerd into comics and stuff, as most of those guys were. But you discover the guys, I don't know, from Spielberg to whoever it is, they've been making films from the age of 10. They get their 10,000 hours up, and my career was sort of strange in the sense that I started really late, to get that experience. I mean, I dabbled, very, very loosely, but I had to try to compress all of this learning into a short period of time in a very, very difficult space. But one of the things that was interesting is when I decided to be a filmmaker at that time, so let's say somewhere in the early 90s, or mid 90s, in the ancient days, films were still being shot on film, and there were film festivals, and the whole art form was a much more curated space, I suppose you'd call it. So and making films is so expensive, even a short film. The very few films were actually made, and only diehards and fools, me being the latter, would commit to making a film, and you'd work to earn money to then spend the money on making the film, and so you're constantly broke because you're constantly just trying to get your hands on the materials and organize people, and even just feeding people lunch on a shooting day, or breakfast and lunch and dinner, that's probably on a low budget film is about half the budget. But you'd shoot on film, and then you could, the very fact that you had made a film was interesting, just by mere virtue of the fact that it existed, because it was so hard to make a film. It's expensive, hiring the equipment, getting the people, getting someone experienced enough and knows how to expose the stock, et cetera, but then suddenly in the 90s, it all changed with sort of basically the digital revolution, really kind of hit super fast. And in the short film space, suddenly anyone could make a film. You'd have a, I don't know if you're familiar with the Premiere editing system, which started like one of the original kind of desktop systems, and it was really amazing. Those first sort of desktop offline editing systems. And you get your hands on a Handycam on an 8, high 8 video. So you could actually shoot a film on a high 8, edit it offline, and then do your sound design and mix and all that sort of stuff. And so then suddenly accountants are making movies, and this short film kind of boom just exploded in the 90s. And so guys like John Paulson, who had started a film festival, you go from having 8 submissions for your film festival to 800. It was really quite extraordinary. And so, but then it also, from the point of view of someone like me, that space became incredibly crowded with noise, and trying to stand up above the sort of madding crowds of people who were occupying that space, making these short films. And so that avenue, that pathway that traditionally someone like me would follow to get noticed, just by making movies, it's like now. So what's interesting is that now the feature film space and the television space, the internet space, it's just noise. There's just so much content. This is a very long answer to your question, isn't it, about whether or not you should go to film school? I'm rattling on. I apologize. I'm sure you get the opportunity to edit this all down, but yeah, I don't know. So that was kind of the world that I came from. That's why I ended up going to film school, because I was just trying to find a way to learn to create, but in a way, more importantly, just trying to find an avenue to get noticed, to get seen, to get an opportunity. So competitive, so difficult. So I suppose the answer to the question is, do you go to film school or not, is whatever's going to work for you. So there you go. I'll be quiet now.
No, you're good. You're good. I love it. You just said to get noticed. So this is where I kind of want to segue into how Sanctum became what it became. So to my understanding, you correct me if I'm wrong here, according to your very trusted Wikipedia page, you apparently were invited to the Avatar set. So how did you even get invited to the Avatar set? Because that's really, I guess, kind of getting noticed in a way.
Yeah, very much so. Well, it's all a continuation of what I was saying before, really, because then we made our first film, which got really good notice in Australia. It was very difficult to get it released internationally, and we released all over the world, but we didn't have a North American theatrical release. It was a low budget. It was a $3 million war film. It was an experiential. The concept behind it was basically, again, it's so making your first movie. What is it? What's it going to be? How can you get it financed? Who's going to give you money to make your first movie? What are the commercial potentials of it? What are the artistic potential of it? And I'd sort of stumbled across this story about a lost patrol set during a real conflict, Australians fighting the Japanese in Papua New Guinea. And it was sort of an episode of Australian history that really we knew very little of in Australia. And I thought, well, this is something that I think we should know more of. People should know more about this campaign. It's a really significant historical moment for Australia because Australia was on the cusp of being invaded, and these young men who went to fight the Japanese, lost their lives in Papua New Guinea, were genuine heroes, and who'd been sort of maligned by history because of, I mean, in my opinion, because of a man called Blamey, who was the most senior general in the Australian Command, who was at that time, MacArthur was living in Australia and running sort of Pacific operations out of Australia, and Blamey sort of became his sort of lickspittle. Anyway, it's a long story. So I did an interview with these guys who have a podcast called Fighting on Film, and their specialty is war movies. So we did a deep dive on the history behind all of that. I can recommend that to your followers as well. Fighting on Film, if you're interested in war movies. Anyway. So I made this movie, and the concept behind it was I thought to make my kind of point of difference, if you like, is what I'll do is I'll structure the story, which is sort of a classic Lost Patrol type story, if you're familiar with the Big Red One or, some of the World War II genre movies. It follows, a bunch of guys who get cut off from their supply lines, behind enemy lines. They've got to make their way back and survive along the way, and various encounters with the enemy and with natural forces and with each other. The drama of the conflict within the group as they make their way home. But it was based on a true story. But I thought, what I'll do is I want it to feel like a horror movie. I want to do sort of war as a horror movie. So I took Predator as my kind of foundational model for telling the story, which was kind of quite, because it was sort of based on certain truths around the experience of the Australian soldiers, and that is that the enemy was this sort of incredibly sophisticated enemy that had a better technology and more experience at fighting and could dissolve into the jungle. Whereas my guys, and that's what those Japanese soldiers were. They were this very experienced battalion of sort of hardened killers who had just been fighting their way through China. These were the bad guys who did all the bad shit in Nanjing, and they had been sort of lobbed into this campaign. But the only Australians that were available to fight were these militiamen, basically, part-time soldiers who'd found themselves in Papua New Guinea because they were had been shuffled out of the way to leave resources for returning Australians from North Africa and all sorts of things. So, but suddenly, 1,000 Australians found themselves fighting 10,000 Japanese in the jungle. And so they had to confront them, and then basically it was what was called a fighting retreat. And the fighting retreat was ultimately seen as cowardice, but it's sort of like, well, what can you do in the jungle, if you've got 10 times the enemy than you? All you're trying to do is to delay them for as long as you can and stretch their supply lines while your guys are coming into the fray. And anyway, so Predator was the model, and we made the movie, and it was great and got really great notice. But its sort of singular Australian focus, I think, made it difficult to sell internationally, even though we got great release in Germany and France and the UK, but not in America. Anyway, the guys that made the movie with me, we then set about trying to make, get some more projects going. Meanwhile, there's this guy called Andrew White. He's a very important player in the Sanctum universe. So that's my life. That's what's going on there with me, and that's taking me up towards 2008, I suppose, 2008, 2009. And meanwhile, in another universe, there's a guy called Andrew White. Now, Andrew White was a farmer, but he was a cave diver and an adventurer and a crazy guy. And he decided he wanted to do a cave dive. I don't know if you've seen the behind the scenes of Sanctum, which I can recommend, and it goes into the details of a lot of this stuff. But so Andrew decided he was going to map the biggest cave system in Australia, which is incredibly remote. It's in a place called the Nullarbor, which is, it's 2,000 miles into central Australia, and this is back in the 80s, or even the late 70s, maybe early 80s. So it was going to be, it had to be a real expedition. You know, you had to get a team of people who had to go out into the middle of nowhere for weeks on end. So you need to have all of the resources and the support infrastructure to do it. And then you're diving in a cave, and as you know from Sanctum, it's sort of, they're in this incredibly dangerous environment. And because, you know, there's no air. And so he was like, and how am I going to pay for this? He's just a farmer. He's just starting out. He's a young man. So he thought, oh, I'll make a documentary about it. While I'm doing it, we'll film it, and then I'll sell. You know, this is his wild concept, because of course he'd never made a film in his life about anything. He's a farmer, and he thought, so I'll get a guy who knows how to make films. So he got an American guy. His name is temporarily escaping me, but it'll come to me. And here's this terrible, what's one of the things that's really hard about this film is a lot of these people are now deceased, including this cameraman. They die in caves and helicopters. Anyway, we can get to that. But this cameraman, he was sort of a legendary figure. He was an American, and they fly him out and to go on this because he's shot video in underwater in caves before. And off they go and they do their expedition, and sure enough, they map the thing, and it's you know, kilometre after kilometre of underwater cave in the middle of, you know, this great artesian basin in Australia. So Australia, like most of the world, is you don't really think about it, but we stand atop these artesian basins. There is so much water underneath us, which is the baseline level of water that's collected over the millennia, you know, thousands and thousands, 10,000, 100,000, a million years. Water is collected into these spaces, you know. Not everywhere, depending on what your rock structure is like and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, so, and then on the last day, they've literally finished the expedition, and they're packing all their kit up, and they're you know, they're a kilometre underground or whatever it is, you know. So it's a big, as you can imagine, just marching your gear out. If you've got, they would have had a base camp. They would have had several camps through the whole system, as is kind of represented in the film. But there would have been the major camp would have been right at the bottom of whatever the descent was to get to where the water is, and that would have had, you know, tents and I mean, again, represent, like in the film, you know, all of all of your generators, your oxygen tanks, your mixers, nitrogen, anything. They were probably going off compressed air then. They wouldn't have been using rebreathers, which we do in Sanctum. Rebreathers are a system where they're kind of the system that was designed for astronauts, where you have a brush system built into what you're wearing, so that what you expel you can breathe back in, and that way you're recycling. It's sort of like a closed system. You're recycling what you breathe in and what you breathe out, as opposed to like an oxygen system. And that's very different systems. And if you remember from the film, we kind of go into a bit of the detail about how that works. Anyway, so these guys shot the movie. They're coming out, and this giant storm comes in, absolutely out of the nowhere, like just out of the blue. And if you see the footage of it, it's really quite incredible. This hole in the ground where the cave was it's like a plug hole for a bathtub, and the water is just pouring in, and they all thought they were going to die. These guys, there's like 20 odd people down there in this cave, and it's just starting to flood. You know, the water's pouring in, the cave's starting to collapse because of that water. The water is rising, so you got water coming in the top, it's coming up. You know, and for a day they just were basically praying, you know, and just thinking that they were going to die. And then it stopped, and then it was like, okay, we're alive, but we're going to get out of here. And then it took a couple of days for them to kind of try to work out how to get out, and for rescue parties to arrive from the top, and eventually everyone got out alive. It was really a bit of a miracle. Anyway, so that's what Andrew White's doing. But here's the thing: is he had an end to his movie, you know, and so they cut this film together. It's called I think it's called Nullarbor Dreaming from memory. I'll have to go back and have a look. I can't remember, but and he ended up selling it to a company called Beyond International, which is this sort of new television company that was just that had started in doing this sort of science. It was like a science show, and then they'd been so hugely successful that expanded into distribution and production and all sorts of things. And anyway, and there's a guy called Michael Borgland was one of the principals, and they formed a relationship. And so Andrew and they were like, well, can you do more? Can you make more films? And so suddenly Andrew became a kind of this filmmaker, and he and his wife started making these natural history documentaries. And then they did that and quite successfully, and they made a couple of films, but then they formed a relationship, and I don't really know, it's all a bit hazy, but he formed a relationship with a very wealthy, I think Canadian too, but a very wealthy guy who had a giant sort of super yacht, who said to them, look, why don't you use my yacht and just sail around the world and make natural history documentaries, which they did for 10 years. I mean, really, it was very much sort of a Jacques Cousteau kind of existence for this guy, Andrew, and his wife, and they had a relationship with the documentary. Well, was it the documentary channel? Or was one of the big, streaming or cable channels in America, and that paid for all of this, and for 10 years they just made these documentaries, and they're all natural history. So it was all about, we're climbing this mountain, or we're swimming with sharks, or we're wrestling crocodiles, or we're whatever it was, these sort of action adventure type natural history documentaries. Anyway, I did that for about 10 years. Very successful, wild adventures. He was given awards. National Geographic made him, I think, Adventurer of the Year. And anyway, one day they are out at the Titanic, and they bump into no, that's Andrew, and that's later. How does no, that's right. So that he's done that for like 10 years, Andrew, and he ends up separating from his wife, and there's personal stuff. I never met his wife, so I'm not exactly sure what happened there, but and he's back on the farm. So he's now, his sort of business, his filmmaking career is kind of over. His marriage is over, and he really doesn't know what to do with himself, to a degree, because he's had, by this stage he's probably 40. I must be older than that. He's more like 45 years old, and he's had this incredible life. And the phone rings, and it's the classic James Cameron wants to speak to you. And he thinks it's a prank call, and so he kind of hangs up, and then the phone rings again. It's like, no, it actually is James Cameron. He wants to speak to you. Because, of course, now we're going back a ways. And James literally is just coming off Titanic, Jim. And so he is, go back to that time and how massive that film was.
I'm still waiting for that call, by the way. I'm still waiting for that call.
We all wait for that call. I did get that call, strangely enough, but anyway, we're getting to that. This is a long story. Once again, you can edit it all down, please. So Andrew, unfortunately, is dead, so he can't speak for himself. So I'm trying to do him justice. And that's all part of this conversation too, because he died making a film with Jim. Jim's last documentary.
Yeah, Deep Sea Challenge.
Exactly, yeah. And there's connections all the way through. And John Garvin, who was the dive master on that, was anyway. So and I'm getting to that, and it all kind of evolves. Everything's interconnected. So Jim wants to dive the Titanic. He wants to make a documentary about the Titanic. So. And Andrew was the go-to guy for dealing with a lot of that stuff. Deep shooting movies at extreme environments, basically, is like, because so much of this stuff is problem solving. It's expedition leading and problem solving as much as it is the craft of actually making the movie. In fact, it's often more than the craft, because if you can't get a camera into a space, then you can't make the movie. So particularly if you're going to trying to make a movie in a particular style. And so they, Andrew flew over to meet Jim, and yeah, we're going to do this thing. And this is the Ghost of the Abyss, I think it was called in the end. And so Jim now starts his kind of natural history phase post Titanic, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And it's really in this phase that he's developing his 3D technology. And Andrew had been, toying with it, but he hadn't done 3D, but he'd made his natural history movies had screened on IMAX and stuff. So they were shooting digitally in high definition, and things were screening in IMAX, and there was all sorts of arguments because IMAX has its own format, it's sort of 60 millimeter or 80 millimeter format, 60 millimeter, 65, I think. Anyway, shooting on film in those days, they don't now, they shoot it digitally, but they'd shoot on 65. Well, it's like Chris Nolan shooting with those IMAX cameras. But actual film now, I think they do it digitally, the IMAX guys. But anyway, and so they set about this expedition, and how do you make a movie about it, and and that became Ghost of the Abyss, and that started Andrew's relationship with Jim, and then they made another one, which is sort of about the potential of, which again is sort of an underwater movie about life, deep sea life, and I'm trying to remember what that was. That one's
Aliens
called
of the Deep.
Aliens of the Deep. Thank you. And about the potential, possibly the life on Mars, and blah blah, and all of it was sort of in service of Jim developing his kind of 3D ideas, and plus his joy of doing that sort of stuff. Anyway, along the way, where they're making these movies, then they did another one. They did a dive on a sunken German battleship, or the Bismarck, maybe something like that.
Yeah.
And Jim, that they used to shoot with this sort of in parallel sort of 3D systems, which is an old sort of technology, and Jim actually developed a whole new technology. God, it's been so long. I'm trying to remember all the names of everyone. I'm trying to remember the name. He developed this technology with another guy, which became this amazing patented technology where basically you could move what's called the IO, the interocular, which is the distance between the two lenses, the stereo lenses, and to the point where you could actually have zero. They could actually be kind of next to each other at a zero. So you're actually shooting in a sort of a mono way. And then as soon as they separate, you're then in stereo. And so he developed this system, and basically the way the system worked, I'm not sure if it's, he probably has entirely new systems he's developed now. He's a crazy technology guy. Like he's so into the engineering and stuff, but he developed this, PACE is the name of the guy. It was the PACE Cameron fusion system, they called it, and this is what they used on the first Avatar. I'm going to go into that into a second, but what they realized was that this sort of side-by-side type stereo, when you capture like that, you're locked into a certain tonality. It's hard to explain, but it's, if you're familiar with, a lot of people kind of really struggle looking at 3D thing. They get what's they call brain tear, because your brain has to sort of fuse two images together to create the 3D experience, which is what your brain is doing now as I look into the world, not as I look at you, you're 2D on my screen, but as I look at the world around me, it's how I process everything in stereo. The brain brings the two images from the two ocular images and brings them together to create the depth, and that the way space works. And so, but when we're watching a movie, a 3D movie, that's what's happening too. Is that you have to force your brain, or allow your brain to fuse the two images together to create the sense of depth on screen. And that can create real issues, particularly if you're locked into, and you think of the old, 3D is old, like goes back to the Marx Brothers, I think, did a 3D movie, and they would have had cameras where the interocular would have been like that, whereas Jim's cameras, you can get an interocular like that. And what he realized was if you could control that, he could control the depth and make the viewing experience a lot more palatable. But it's sort of like, well, how do you get lenses that close together? Because the technology itself made that physically impossible. Well, if you have one lens vertical and one lens horizontal, you can shoot this one through a two-way mirror, and then get to effectively, then I can move this camera anywhere relative to this one, and they're not going to bump into each other because it's vertical. So that's what the Pace Cameron system became, this sort of vertical camera and this horizontal camera.
Wow.
So then you've got to imagine, it's all well and good with me doing with fingers like this, but imagine like a gigantic camera rigs, and the rig itself was like the size of a refrigerator. I mean, it was like a whole thing, I can tell you. So, I mean, it's like the technology now, it's like everything has just changed so quickly. But anyway, so they were the cameras that they developed when they were doing these documentaries. And then while that's going on simultaneously, Jim is developing his projects, and there was multiple ones that could have gone, but the one that they settled on was this little film called Avatar, which you might be familiar with. And, part of what was paying for these documentaries was his development fees for Avatar and so on. And I learned a great deal about Jim, but from Jim about making movies and working with the studios. And it's hard, but one of the things he was and is, doesn't really matter so much now, but getting the studio on the hook. And the way you get them on the hook is you get them to spend money. And that's what they did. They'd invested a lot into Avatar, and there was a lot of testing going on because as you know, with Avatar, it was a fusion of not only those 3D systems, but with the motion capture systems, and all of it working simultaneously. And that was a trip. I tell you, to go and see that for the first time was like, whoa, what the hell's going on here? So that's all going on, and Andrew is sitting there going, well, one day Jim is going to make this movie, and then I'm kind of out of a job. So what am I going to do? So he's got this true story about getting trapped underground in this cave, and he pitches it to Jim, and Jim says, well, let's develop that. I'll make that movie because Andrew's getting Jim into cave diving and scuba diving. Jim's an avid avid scuba guy, and this is over years. I mean, all of this is going on, and they ended up shooting a film as a sort of as a test, partly as a test, partly for their own edification, partly just for fun. A 3D. They go to a cave in Florida, very famous cave system, which actually you actually enter the cave system from the ocean. And you sort of swim in, and so it's where there's a point that you transition as you swim through the water, where the briny ocean water marries the perfectly clear artesian water, and there's this sort of it's quite fascinating to have that experience. And they go and shoot this movie, and they kind of like, they're doing a camera test, and they go, but it being Jim is sort of like, it becomes this giant sort of thing. And they're kind of mucking around. They don't have a script or anything. They're apparently, from what I wasn't there, obviously, and the stories they've told me is, they're kind of sitting around at night and having a few gins or whatever, or I think tequila was Jim's drink of choice at the time. And Andrew drank scotch by the litre. They're like, oh, and they come up with this story, and it's like, oh, these guys are diving, and then someone cuts the line, and blah blah blah, and they go and there's no actors, there's just all, and they shoot this thing. They take in the lights and they light up the cave, and they shoot it, and they end up cutting together like a 9 or 10 minute film. And it was one of the first things. It was the first thing I ever saw in 3D was this film on the Avatar set when I went to John. I'm trying to get there, trying to get to the answer of the question. So they shoot this film, and it's so cool. Like this, like it's so great. Like it's nothing happens in it, but it's a James Cameron movie. Like Anyway, he's a really good film. He's a really good filmmaker. Um, and and then Jim makes Avatar and starts on that adventure. And so Andrew is now trying to get this thing. Now, so meanwhile, around about this time, I'm made Kokoda, and Australia, they're starting to, they introduce a new tax system to help make movies, basically a tax rebate, which is sort of, now is kind of really common, but at the time was quite innovative, which is sort of like a big chunk of your budget can get rebated through the tax system in Australia to encourage you to shoot in Australia. So they're like, okay, so we can make a $30 million movie for, basically for about $8 million US. So this is going back to 2010, or back then, probably 2006 or 7, when they were originally doing budgets and things. So that's a much more palatable idea to be able to approach a studio and say, look, we want to make this cave diving movie. We don't want it's not going to have any big movie stars in it. It's going to be a modest budget. Jim's going to direct it. But then Jim had decided he didn't feel like the whole Avatar machine was really rolling out, and it's sort of like, well, it's not in James Cameron land. I think, I mean, God knows how much that first one cost, but I think it probably costs about twice as much as everyone says it cost. It's like, you can't. $30 million is the catering budget. It's a whole different universe to make a movie, and if you're kind of brand Cameron, it's just not a space you want to be in. Because you've already been there, you're doing something else. You're building universes. You are a one-man Marvel kind of thing, and so they need a director. So Andrew then starts running around trying to find a director. Now they were going to shoot it in Mexico. One of the big things is they wanted to shoot it all on location, and then of course you realise very quickly that that's just literally impossible. It's literally impossible to shoot a movie like this on location with actors untrained. It's so complicated. Shooting in caves is so complicated, which was part of our experience. I mean, we ended up building our caves, but effectively it was still shooting in caves. And then we shot some second unit and some real caves in South Australia. But they needed a director, and Kokoda was out, and Andrew started asking, who's the guy to direct this movie, and then mutual acquaintances sort of directed him to me. He found me and then pitched me to Jim. And ended up sending Kokoda, my war movie, to Jim, and he saw it and really liked it. I'm not sure if he watched more than 10 minutes of it, but he saw enough because he was at that time literally making Avatar, but he liked enough of what he saw to. I know he saw the opening shot because the first thing he said to me, and if you see the movie, I do like a 4-minute single, oneer. So I know he saw that because the first thing he said to me when I met him was, "Wow, it was fucking amazing, man." So they flew me out to meet him in New Zealand, where he was basically wrapping Avatar, and they're doing pickups and some second unit stuff. But of course with Jim, Jim never stops. He never shuts a movie down. He never stops. Like, he drives everyone insane. With Avatar, they were shooting pickups on that thing like, 2 weeks before the bloody thing was released. I kid you not. Like, because Jim's so sort of smart, and it's like it's a digital release, so that the digital intermediate is all delivered, but it's different distribution networks to the old print ones where you're literally shipping, your prints to the theaters, whereas this is sort of a digital delivery system. Anyway, so so they flew me across to Auckland, to Wellington, initially Auckland, but then Wellington, where they were shooting in these warehouses. They didn't actually have a studio then. I think they had a couple of really small, stages, and Jim just took over a couple of these giant warehouses as well. And the footprint on that movie was massive, as you can imagine. But old mate Hobbit man, Peter Jackson, they just started, I think had just started building the studios there. So it didn't have the infrastructure that it does now. It's massive now. So yeah, we met, and he was really big on And that was the start of the kind of crazy adventure. I mean, that had taken about a year to get to that point, though, from meeting Andrew to meeting Jim, and I was working with the writer and working with Andrew on the screenplay. It was a much bigger film because when in Jim's sort of early involvement, you know, it had a Jim sort of world view, but then trying to then wrestle a film into a $30 million budget. You know, you've got to start pulling pages and rewriting it and coming up with strategies about how to tell the story and minimize the budget and all that kind of stuff. And you know, and then I know, like, was the amazing privilege in a way of the experience was, you know, meeting Jim, being on set, watching him work, because he was still shooting first unit stuff as well as second unit stuff. And you know, I saw him shoot some of the battle scenes or the material for the battle scenes, first unit and second unit. But I saw early drafts of sequences, literally out of the Avid, you know, and projected in. They had their own little 3D cinema that they'd set up in the facility, and watching like an early the sequence that I saw from really from the page. No, I don't think I ever read a script actually, but it was. I don't know if I'm sure you are familiar with the first film where the Sully character, he goes into the world for the first time. So he's gone into the body and he's in the world for the first time and discovering the world. And that's when I think he meets the female character, Nefertiti, Neriri, what? Anyway, you know who I'm talking about. And just literally watching it out of the Avid and trying to get my head around, like just getting my head around how the 3D worked, let alone the motion capture stuff. And Jim was shooting in a system. It's hard to, it's sort of, you almost have to see it to understand it, but he'd shoot. God, where do you begin? But because you're shooting for live action, knowing that there's motion capture elements that have to come in, or you're shooting motion capture stuff, knowing that there's live action stuff that has to come in, and sometimes both simultaneously, and shooting live action that's collecting metadata that then's driving your virtual cameras in your motion capture stuff, and vice versa. You know, getting metadata from the motion capture stuff that then feeds back into motion capture cameras for live action elements and stuff like that, and shooting it all, you know, in 3D, which in simple terms, you know, you double the production of everything because you've got to have 2 cameras in every shot. So if it's a 3 camera setup, it's actually a 6 camera setup, essentially, in terms of the physical cameras that you're using, and so you've got the set then the crew expands, the production expands, because then you've got more people to lift the camera, more people to focus the camera, more people to pull the IO, more people to watch the 3D, more people to sort of curate the technology. You know, you've got to have the tech nerds who are dealing with the ones and zeros, you know, coming down the pipeline. With incredibly sort of complicated technological shoot. And so that was going on, and I was trying to get my head around that, let alone, you know, deal with the actual making the story. So that's when I met Jim, and then I was able to watch that, because that, as I say, is literally out of the Avid. They're assembling it. The film hadn't even been finished, and I could watch that sequence, and that became. I saw that sequence probably 3 or 4 times through the process of the film finishing through its post-production path, until finally seeing it actually at an IMAX screen here in the Gold Coast, when we were in pre-production on Sanctum. Which was amazing. It was an amazing journey, because I was going back and forth to LA and watching the film develop, and I spent a lot of time in LA going back and forth and having meetings with Jim as we were developing, financing the picture, getting people attached, making the movie, and then finishing it and promoting it in the end. Anyway, that's all another story, and that's a very long answer once again to the question of how did I get involved with the project.
Well, I didn't even know he was going to originally direct this, so maybe that's talked about in the behind the scenes, but I haven't seen those yet. So that's really cool that at some point this was going to be a Cameron film. That was decided against. He lands as executive producer, which is a little different than producer. Was he pretty hands-on in the whole process, or was he kind of like, this is your movie, I'm just going to slap my name on this and that's going to sell it?
It's sort of a mix of both. I mean, um, he's a hands-on guy with everything he does in life, so there's just no way he's going to sit back on anything. I think, probably from, how you butter your toast to producing your movie. So very hands-on, but as I say, a little distracted by his own universe, because when we were in pre-production basically for a year on Sanctum, he was finishing Avatar, and literally, I think our first day of production, literally our first shooting day of principal photography, was the day Avatar was released.
Oh, wow.
So in a way, he only has so much brain power, and he was in Los Angeles, we were in Australia, and that kind of made a break. And it was kind of good because, the danger of Jim is he's hands-on, and if he's going to get involved, he's going to get involved. So having that distance actually was in a way beneficial for us, because it actually allowed us the space to make the movie. Because it was sort of, Jim hadn't operated in a space like this for a long time, essentially a low budget. I mean, it's a $30 million film, but really you're trying to make a $100 million film for $30 million. And so it feels like a low budget film when you're making it. And it took us years and years to make, in the end, really. I think my involvement, I must have been involved for almost 4 years by the time it was actually released and out in cinemas. I mean, so our shoot was 70 days of photography. So that's not 70 consecutive days. So that's working 5 days a week. So whatever that works out to in weeks. It was a long shoot. And the reason why it was 70 is because we had about a month of components. There were location components, and then studio components, and then underwater components, which is still at the studio, but this is shooting at the tank. And that's when Jim came, is when we started doing that underwater work. So we were probably, by that stage, 3 months into the shoot, something like that. Maybe 2 months, something like that. And then we spent a month doing our underwater work, and then we went back and did location work for a second unit, pickups in caves. So Jim was very much, I was doing drafts on the script, polishing John Garvin's script, working with Andrew, and then basically all of these drafts would be sent to Jim. And the hardest thing with working with Jim is he's just got so much shit on. Getting any time is just impossible. So if you want to have coffee with the dude, you've got to book it a month in advance. You know what I mean? And so, like, I mean, I can just tell you stories that Andrew would get so frustrated. He'd go, "F it, Al, you're getting on a plane. I'm putting you on a plane. You're going to go and see Jim, and you're just going to knock on his door every day until he bloody sees you." So they'd stick me on an airplane. I kid you not. They'd stick me on a plane and fly me to LA, put me up in a hotel which was down the road from Lightstorm. And I'd bloody every day, I'd just get out and I'd march up the road, up Santa Monica Boulevard, kind of thing. Let me in, And Lightstorm was this sort of like 3-story, 4-story building, standalone building. I don't think he shared it with anyone else. And as I say, it was like 3 or 4 stories, and the top story was where Lightstorm was, which is so cool. Walking into I don't know if you've been there, but you kind of if you walk in and it's just got all these big posters for all these movies down the corridor as you walk in. It's incredibly intimidating. And one of the floors was his technology floor, and it was like his R&D floor. I don't think I ever went there. It was all a bit kind of like CIA. He has these tech guys just doing shit for him, which you don't even know about, and because they're building cameras and things, developing all this tech, and that was sort of like on the middle floor, and the bottom was sort of he had a cinema on the bottom floor, and some admin stuff, and anyway, and I'd just go in and just sort of sit there and just hope that he'd kind of see me out of the corner of his eye, and eventually he would, and then we could have a conversation because production had kind of stopped with the executive producer. So what Jim was able to do was, and really it's less about selling the film, it's more about financing the film and getting it financed. But the Jim imprimatur is like a big deal, like it opens the door, obviously. And so Andrew was able to then go, here's the film, here's the script. James Cameron's going to, which just means he's going to oversee the production. And so it's going to have that sort of James Cameron imprimatur in terms of the storytelling and a certain level of production value. And here's this film that we made in a cave in Florida. And because Jim had his own 3D cinema, basically at Lightstorm, he could bring all these people in and then screen the movie to them and say, because this again, you got to remember, when we were financing, Avatar hadn't been released. So no one, the whole 3D as a concept, as a marketing thing, as a visual experience is still this nascent sort of, is it going to work? What is it? How does it work? And is, all pre-Avatar. So it was like, so I was sort of right in there in this sort of pre-Avatar days. And they're trying to sell as much as Jim, if you remember, like he's trying to sell the technology to the exhibitors as much as anything, because it's like, we're going to roll out all these digital cinemas to screen this thing, and I've got to get everyone wearing glasses and all this sort of stuff. When most of the exhibitors they're only set up for the 35mm exhibition, and all of this is going on. So in a way, Sanctum becomes a part of this kind of process of getting people into a 3D cinema where he can screen a 3D work and say, voila. This is 3D. This is how it works. This is the experience. And I'm telling you, this film was so cool. This little short film that he made, so cool. And he had a good fortune because he lit it. Whereas with Sanctum, there's another story if you're interested in that. The whole point is you're in a cave. There's no light, but 3D demands light, and the camera, Jim's cameras. So we literally used Jim's cameras from Avatar to shoot our movie. Completely inappropriate technology for what we were trying to do. That's another story. But it was Jim's cameras, and we're going to use them. Okay, so that's just, these are one of the rules. It was like, Alister, no 3D, no movie. Because I think I made the mistake at one stage of bringing up, oh man, I'd love to shoot this on film. It's like, Alister, no 3D, no movie. So, okay, I got a boss. So that's how we're financing. Jim's able to bring all the people into the room and build the energy around that. And so he did. And we got a company called Wayfair out of New York, which I don't think exists anymore. We got, and then we got Aaron Ryder and the Film Nation, name not coming to me. It'll come to me shortly. Glenn Basner, I think so. Film Nation guys, and they got involved, and then we basically started making the movie. I'm going to try to tell you the James Cameron stuff because it's a James Cameron podcast, not an Alister Grierson podcast. But and then the movie fell over, and we were just in turnaround for like a year. Even after we'd started pre-production, it was just a nightmare because there was a whole legal thing again. And this, I suppose, is the James Cameron part of the story, is that so you've got to think of Jim. Jim's not a human anymore. He's some other creature, and part of that is he's kind of like he'd probably hate me to say that, right? Because he's a great family man. He's very human. Don't get me wrong, but he's not a human. He doesn't live a life the way that you and I might think of living a life. Talking which just reminded me, I've got to send an email. And he's like a one-man corporation. So there's always like 7 people in the room with him because there's just so much going on all the time. I mean, that's not always the case, but it's kind of sort of how it feels anyway from an outsider's point of view. And so trying to get him alone, trying to get him to make a decision, like to sign off on a creative decision. So this is the point of the story in a way. So we're in Australia trying to put this film together, and we're like, and then the executive producers in New York are like, well, has Jim okayed the script, say this draft? Has Jim ticked off this draft? And it's like, oh well, yeah, yes and no, not kind of officially, but he's given us permission to do it. It's like, oh, we've got to, Jim's got to sign off on the draft. We can't move forward until Jim signs off on the draft. And it's like, okay, now we've got to get Jim to read the bloody thing. Well, getting Jim to spend 90 minutes to read a screenplay is when just getting him to stop for 10 seconds is almost impossible. So that's when they get us like, Alister, you're getting on a plane. We're going to get you to, go and bang in his door until you make him read the screenplay kind of thing. So it was a bit like that, and we'd kind of grind to a halt for a while until Jim would read the screenplay and sign off it. And then, so in the production pipeline, you've got a lot of these decisions, signing off on cast, signing off on key crew elements, signing off on certain technology elements, signing off on builds and so on. So we would think it up, set it in motion, go and do it, but then Jim would have to sort of sign off on it. And I can't think of ever him sort of turning around and say, yeah, the f- are you doing? I don't think we had one casting thing where he and I didn't agree, and he was probably right, of course, because he's James Cameron. But there was only one casting issue which he didn't agree with my choice. And otherwise, it was really kind of playing. It was just amazing. And then of course, then you shoot the thing, and then you're editing it, and then he's much more. So then by then, Avatar has come out, and that world has become, that part of his world. And so then he's got a lot more time to. So he was very involved in the editing process, in the sense of not in terms of sitting in the suite with us or anything. But he'd see each draft, and I'd fly to LA and we'd screen it, and I'd go to his ranch it doesn't exist anymore. I think he's moved everything to New Zealand now, but down in what was down south on the coast there? What's that down there? Malibu. He used to have a ranch, and he had a 3D set up there, and a whole other kind of another branch of Lightstorm sort of set up down on the ranch down there. So we go and screen the film, and then have discussions, and I'd go back and we'd edit it and blah blah blah, and then we had test screenings and all that sort of stuff, and then by then Universal's involved, and then you're dealing with the head of the studio and all that sort of stuff, and then it becomes another universe going on there as well. And keep going. I've got to. Do you mind? And forgive me if we just keep talking. I have to send this email, or I'm going to get in big trouble, because I've just got a time constraint. So bear with me while I do that. And do you want to take over talking for a while?
No, it's I think it's fascinating, because everyone has their kind of, when I see from executive producer James Cameron, I'm always curious what exactly that means. My kind of understanding of it is executive producer is really more so the financer, kind of assembling the money, selling the movie, whereas a producer appears to be a lot more hands-on. They might be on set, from time to time. And so I always like to kind of differentiate that, because he's played in both fields. He's been a producer and an executive producer. What I find fascinating is there's a very loose Cameron connection, and that's Yoan, who I wanted to make sure I could figure out how to say his name properly. Yoan, who is of course in Titanic. That's, I think, really where a lot of people know that face from. And watching him in your film was just really cool. So was that sort of, I know, talking about casting a little bit, I have a sneaking suspicion that wasn't a casting choice that Cameron was against when you told him Yoan was going to be in it.
Yeah, I mean, so that character was obviously super important, and we had a lot of difficulties in a way getting that, because there was some part of the whole shtick of the movie was it's not going to be a movie star driven film, and Jim had a kind of a lot of things that he was trying to do Um, um, give me 2 seconds. So Jim had a few stipulations, and that it was, he wanted, because Avatar was going to be its own thing in terms of how the 3D worked, in terms of people's experience of it, and what he was trying to sell to the, as an idea, as a, as a one-man kind of Hollywood machine, trying to reinvent the industry, trying to breathe life into an industry that even back then, 10 years ago, was starting to stumble. On the one hand, but he wanted the tech, he wanted to exploit the technology to say, pardon me, you don't have to make a $200 million movie. You can make a $1 million movie, or you can make a documentary, or you can do whatever it is with the technology. The technology is the technology. It's just up to you to work out how to use it. It's all about being experiential. It's about the audience, what they're experiencing and what it's for. So he one of the reasons he liked the cave idea was it was so different to his world, that it would showcase the 3D in a different environment. It'd be a much more low budget sort of affair. So it wasn't going to be a finance process driven by big movie stars, which has always been his mantra. It's sort of interesting when you think of his movies, when you think of Titanic, by way of example. I mean, Leo was really still just an emerging guy. None of the, I mean, there was a couple of sort of solid, I mean, Billy Zane was probably almost the biggest movie star in that movie at the time. Maybe, anyway. So that was his sort of philosophy. He was also very much, he didn't want people interfering with the script. We had a lot of swearing in the movie, and at one stage they wanted us to remove the swearing, and he really kicked up a fuss about that. And insisted that he wanted it to be kind of earthy and raw, and as much as he could. It's complicated. Every word in that movie has been resunk, so re-recorded in a studio, and none of the native dialogue was kept because. And that creates its own very strange artifice when you're watching and experiencing the movie. That was very new to me doing that. I mean, I'd done re-records before, but not at that scale. And anyway, that has its own thing. So, so because we're shooting in Australia, and I was going to earlier talking about how there was a new tax regime came in, and that's how it was decided. Sorry, and I missed that part of the story earlier. The reason why I was directing was they had to do it in Australia to access this rebate. So they needed an Australian director in order to get that rebate. And in fact, to get the rebate, there's a whole bunch of boxes that you have to tick. And one of it is, a certain number of the cast have to be locals. They have to be Australian. A certain number of the crew has to be Australian. It's sort of like that. It's sort of like, we'll give you access to this tax break as long as you tick these boxes. So we had to have these Australian leads in most of the roles. So most of the actors are Australian. Richard Roxburgh's our main lead. Reese Wakefield, the young kid. Reese is doing great stuff now in America too. But Richard was a fantastic actor. But the New York finance guys, the Wayfair guys, and the Film Nation guys who were going to. So the Film Nation guys are basically the international sales agent. They made a ton of movie from Sanctum, I think. In fact, they're the ones probably really the only ones who did. We made money, which is amazing because it's pretty rare for movies to actually make money. But they were like, look, we want to have. I think it was probably the Film Nation guys more than anyone drove Yoan's because they wanted to have someone with a certain amount of cachet, particularly I think for their European sales. And I mean, as you know, the film business is very market driven. It's very market oriented, and to its benefit and it's a curse. Jim's sort of been lucky; he's been able to operate outside of that in a lot of ways because his films have been so high concept. And I mean, Jim's great good fortune was that Piranha 3 or whatever it was a disaster. Piranha 2. And that he got kicked off that. That was probably the biggest twist in his life. It was the best thing that ever happened to him. And then Terminator was just such a massive hit. And then that platform and that model in a way, which was, I mean, Jim squeezed the blood out of the stone to get that movie made, Terminator, and to shoot it. I mean, for what was then a modest budget for what they achieved. And all of his films have been like that ever since. And so they're concept driven, not star driven, and they're production value driven and innovative and all the things which, obviously that's what this podcast is probably about, is how he's sort of able to do that. So that was one of his things. There's no movie stars. And we actually we looked at a lot of people, obviously, and I had lots of conversations with lots of different people, and there was a lot of interest there. And we had some who were really close, and then there was clashes, and then the movie got, as I say, it kind of got into turnover, and so everything we'd lined up kind of then fell over, and it's sort of, that's the thing, is like when movies go into turnaround, they usually die. Turnaround is just means you're done. So when a producer uses that word, you're just like, oh God, And but we got to back up, and then suddenly you make the movie, and suddenly it's like a giant boulder rolling down a hill. You kind of, who's the Greek mythological character? Thucydides? No, it's the Thucydian trap. Who's the guy who has to roll the boulder up the hill for eternity? That guy.
Okay.
You know who I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about?
I know that image. Yeah, I don't know the name.
That's his curse. He's got to roll the boulder up the hill, and then of course you get almost to the top, and you lose control of it, and it rolls down, and you've got to do it again. That's what making a movie's like. And but then suddenly the movie is happening, the money's in the bank, and suddenly there's this machine that it's the boulder rolling down the hill, and it's like, we're shooting in 20 days. We're like literally in first day of production in 20 days, and we don't have our actors. It's like, so we're kind of like that, still trying to find the Yoan character. And I'm trying to, I can't remember who brought it up, but I think it was the Film Nation guys. Well, let's get Yoan. I think they might have just done something with him, and he had a great reputation. He was, I think he'd done a Marvel movie, and his career is sort of strange and interesting. He ended up he's done a ton of stuff in Australia. It's really interesting, films and television, ever since Sanctum. And I think in fact, he married an Aussie girl in the end. He was married to an Irish. I think she was Irish, maybe she was English. When he was here doing Sanctum, but and so that's how it was sort of, Yoan was our kind of movie star. Even though he wasn't a movie star, but he was a guy that was going to give it a little bit of, in some of those territories, just that little bit of a boost. One of the tricky things with Sanctum, and tricky things with having Jim on the poster, and I mean, if I can just jump forward, it may or may not be a question, but is, people trying to work out what the movie was. And so there's a couple of elements to that. One is it actually a James Cameron movie or not? And at that time, I mean, Avatar had come out by the time we released, but, you look at the poster, there's no movie stars on it, there's no real name recognition, so it's sort of like, well, is it a James Cameron natural history documentary? Because that's what he's been doing, so what is it, because it was sort of like, I describe it to people, it's sort of like, here's the poster, here's the image, and it's like, James Cameron presents movie name, directed by Alister Grierson. And so if you're a person at the cinema or wherever it is you're getting your media from, it's kind of like, well, whose movie is it? And then you look closer and you go, produced by, okay, so it's not a James Cameron movie, but he's involved. Well, he's not going to be involved with something that's completely shit. So that's kind of the branding, I suppose. That's the first thing. The second thing is, but what is it? I don't recognize any names here, and it doesn't have Leo in it. It doesn't have Mel. It doesn't have, whoever. Truth is, they didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know how to sell the movie, because it's sort of like, how do you sell a kind of a unbranded, it's not coming from a known IP. It's not sci-fi. It's not horror. It's not pure action adventure. It's not comedy. Where does it fit in a genre space It's not a James Cameron movie, but it is. You know, it's not a. So what is it, and how do you sell it? And in the end, they threw us out on Super Bowl weekend, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is the worst weekend of box office in America. And it's complicated because you're doing a simultaneous international release. So Super Bowl weekend's got nothing to do with whatever the weekend is in Germany or France or the UK or any of that. I mean, there might be 1 or 2 weeks in difference in the release, but it's all happening simultaneously. So you're trying to find a release that's going to, you know, that once you break in North America, you've got to be everywhere else. So I've now jumped forward to that. I can't even remember what the original question was. Forgive me.
I had just mentioned the whole I always want to say Eoin, but it's a Yoan.
Yoan, yeah.
yeah.
Yoan. I couldn't even tell you how to pronounce his last name. Griffith or Griffith. I think it's actually Griffith, but it's sort of spelt Grufford. It's, you know, Yoan, but and Yoan is just Welsh for John, by the way. So it's just John in Welsh, Yoan. And there's a whole bunch of different ways to spell it and stuff like that. But and let me say this about Yoan though. He's just, or was, I haven't spoken to him for many years, but I can't imagine anything's changed. Just the most lovely man. Just a really, really just a hard worker, complete professional. And and to finish the story before, it's kind of like we're like, geez, I think 20 days out and we don't have that character. And it's kind of this way Yoan is, we'll get him involved. Yoan flew in. I mean, after, like, it took a while to kind of work out the paperwork, and he was initially he was a bit skeptical or didn't want to be involved, and he had a young family. I think he just had a baby. They were living in LA. He was like, I don't want to go to Australia, you know, and spend I don't want to spend, you know, 3 or 4 months in Australia. But in the end, he was like, okay, you know, and he did it. And he flew in. I literally met him while he was doing a costume fitting the night before his first day on set. And we'd already started shooting. We were probably, have we started shooting, or was that the first? No, that was the first day. So that was the first day principal photography was him on his first day in Australia. He literally flew in that night, the night before, did his costume fitting for the next day's work, and we were shooting. And we were shooting at like 5 a.m. in the morning out in the jungle somewhere. You know, and he was great. He was just a fabulous guy. So
I want to pull this up here because I want to see. I like doing this when I have a director on. I like to pull up a scene from the film. No audio. Don't want to get a copyright. But I just want to look at the visuals of it, and if you can walk me through your memory of shooting it, because something I love talking about. Yeah. Like, you'll be able to see it. I'll see it, and then just kind of narrate over it.
I can.
But I love talking about, because one of my favorite things is the fact that Cameron is obsessed with water, and this film really leans into that. It is very much The Abyss in that regard, and the fact that this is all practical. It's right. This is not CGI water. This is water that you're actually dealing with, which is unpredictable. And so this is probably my favorite scene from the movie, and so I just want to get your take on it. So climbing the waterfall.
Oh, okay, great.
So here we go. So when you look at this, just kind of walk me through what you remember.
So this is a trip, man. This was a standalone set that we built basically for this scene, and there's a couple of scenes there, but this was going to be a major set piece in the movie, you know, and so we spent a lot of money in it, and it was a standalone set. So it's hard to imagine. So you've got to build this set. It's like 10 meters high, like it's massive. It's a massive set, and you've got to pump water through the top of it to be the waterfall, and then down the bottom, and then you've got to collect that water and pump it back up. So you have to have a pumping system that's collecting the water, and they're spitting it out of the top. I think it was something like 10,000 liters of water a minute or something. Like, it's a massive amount of volume of water. So what you do is in the studio, the first thing you do is you build a swimming pool, essentially, and then you build the set inside the swimming pool, because, you know, in the end the water is getting up to probably 1.5 meters, you know, 7 feet or so high. Was it that high? It's kind of been that high. No, it must have been less. So it must have been more closer to like 5 feet. You know, at its deepest point. And so the water's going to pool there or collect there, and then you've got to pump it, this giant pump. So you've got to imagine this. It sounds like you're in a aircraft hangar with an F-18 fighter plane roaring in the background, because you've got these pumps going, pumping this water, and then you've got the sound of the water itself sort of crashing into the ground. So everyone's wearing earplugs and earphones and all this sort of stuff, and I'm directing people with this megaphone. Like it was a bit of a throwback to the 20s, when people are directing with the but it was like a powered megaphone thing, so just so people could hear what I was saying. And we had you can see some behind the scenes footage of it and some stills. You see, we're sort of shooting on this massive 50-foot crane that can extend in and out and left and right and up and down. And we had two of them, in fact, sort of doing things simultaneously. So you're coordinating all of these things. And in the end, it's sort of like, again, you can imagine the build on that set and then operating it, it was just vastly expensive. And in our film world, it was sucking up so much of the budget, but it was a really important set piece, because a lot happens. There's a big plot point. There's character stuff. There's action elements and all of these things. And it was such a big deal, but it was also technically like, how are we going to do it? Like, it's just so complicated to shoot with the actors, with the stunt people. And so I came up with this idea that what we should do is we build two worlds. So if you remember the scene, there's sort of like, I can't remember how that, oh, that's right. So the cave's just flooded, hasn't it? And then they've kind of like, they're trying to make their way out of the cave, and then they get to the waterfall and they've got to get up. Okay. And the kid comes back. Yoan gets up, and Yoan's up there, and then the girl's coming up, and then she falls, I think, something like that. Oh no, she gets up, doesn't she? And then it's the guy, it's the kind of Papuan guide who doesn't make it. But there's all of these elements happening at the top of the waterfall. And it's sort of like, well, how are we going to do this? So what I thought what we should do is we'll build two of those worlds, one at 10 meters high and one at 2 meters high, basically just above the waterline. And we'll have a plug that I can, basically a fake wall that I can move in. So when I'm sort of out, when I'm wide, there's the waterfall world. But when I'm doing my tight stuff, I just pull that plug out and I can work in close at 2 meters high. So in that way, it's it's safer, it's easier to work, you can work faster and stuff like that. So that was the way that we kind of dealt with creating the illusion that we were much higher than we actually were for most of it. Because it was incredibly complex to shoot, as you can imagine. And we spent a lot of time nutting out exactly how to do it and working with the technology too, because, and here's the thing too, with Jim's cameras, they weren't designed to do what we were doing with them. We were almost trying to shoot in almost a documentary style sometimes. And the thing with those cameras is they're just not designed, they're so big, like the rig is so unwieldy. And now if you're doing Avatar, where the first sort of 20 pages are live action. And then you have this sort of mix of live action, but really the majority of the film is in this sort of virtual space. So he's dealing with that problem. And then he's really in a virtual space, bringing in the live action elements, which is a whole other thing. Whereas we're all essentially location work, working with these cameras that weren't designed to do what we were doing with them. And one of the things is water, and electronic cameras. And so as you can imagine, if you bring in a body of water into any enclosed space, it starts doing weird stuff. Like it starts affecting the temperature around you. It starts affecting the humidity around you. And then you start splashing the water, or in the case of making a waterfall, there's just water everywhere. So those cameras just broke down on us every 10 minutes. It was like we had to and we'd have this sort of chain of just, as soon as the camera broke down, we could try to shift it out and bring in a new camera. Because as I say, with every rig is actually two cameras in one. And if you lose one of the cameras of the two, you lose the two cameras. So we'd actually have to we'd then have to swing in a new rig, swing that out, and shoot on that until that one broke down, basically. And then, well, in the background, the engineers are busily trying to fix the broken one, and then bring that in. And it was super hard. Like the technical elements of making the movie, and people will never really have a full appreciation of what's happening, the engine room sort of underneath it all. You know, and I mean, you know, I was never able to really make the movie I wanted to make because of the technical restrictions. You know, shooting live and in 3D on a modest budget with what we were trying to do was just technically insanely challenging. I mean, it's honestly, sometimes I look at it and just go, it's just a miracle we made it at all. Like so much, there's so much going on. We had the two lead actors, Richard and Alison, or Alice. We had an Alison and Alison. It gets confusing. I think it was Alice. Anyway, sharing a full face mask, you know, 20 feet underwater, and acting, you know, story beats and for performance. That's bonkers. And this is all driven by Jim in a way. And this is this relationship that Jim had with Andrew. You know, they're crazy people. You know, Jim's a crazy guy. He's a fearless person, I think, you know, in life. And you know, I mean, that stunt that he did going to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, I mean, that's just bonkers. That's crazy. And so his sort of expectation, and that's why I think, you know, not so much now. I think he's kind of mellowed a little, probably not much, but you know, he's a hard taskmaster, and he was a hard taskmaster for us. There's no question, and we wanted him to be happy. We wanted to please the boss, you know, and so going all in. I mean, for example, I had to learn to cave dive.
Wow.
before I was kind of allowed to make the movie, and it's kind of a bit like, do I have to? I'm not sure I want to do that. Like I'm reading the script about all these people dying in caves, and it's sort of like I'm not sure I want to do that. But I wanted the job, you know, and it was like, so I literally, and I had never been scuba diving, so I had to get my open water, and day 3 of open water, and I was trained to cave dive by John Garvin, who was the writer of the screenplay. Because, you know, and that's his thing was technical diving, cave diving, you know. And Andrew, and on day 3 of my learn to be a scuba diver day, it was in a cave in South Australia, which actually is in the movie. If you remember when they Richard and Alice, oh, God, and Alison, get in the water, and they kind of go through the caves, and that's when that scene happens later. But if you remember, that they go in, and we do this sort of reveal. We sort of with Richard, he kind of goes underwater, and then we're with him, and it was an amazing thing. We actually dug into the floor of the studio here. They were so supportive of us, and we built the crossover point, basically the sump. We actually built 2 sumps in the studio floor, and then that sump and then it has a little kind of a little opening in it, and then we built the cave, the underwater cave. What we did was, just as a background to it, is we built a cave system knowing that we had to build an underwater cave system, so a dry system and a wet system, because part of the movie is kind of dry and part's wet. So we built a cave that we could basically kind of pick up and then put in the swimming pool, flood the swimming pool at the studio, and then that became our underwater world. So it's the same cave, but one's underwater and one's dry. This cave that I went in had a big cabin, basically. And that's when, so in that scene, when they kind of get in the water and we show the cases, and then I think at some stage we do a big kind of reveal, and we show them sort of as much a sort of small divers in this much bigger world. And that's all in camera. That's literally all second unit stuff that we shot in South Australia. So that's a real cave, and that's one of the few shots that are actually a real cave. The rest we shot in the studio. But yeah, I had to. So that's where I learned to scuba dive in a cave, and it was crazy. But that's the Jim thing. It's just kind of like, mate, you're all in. You got to go all in. And we did, you know, and And so that's why doing those gags, like the sharing the face masks and getting the actors, all the actors trained and learned to dive, and getting them actually in the water doing that, because we wanted to see the actors' faces, so we custom built Andrew. Here's the thing: it's like, again, it's like there's just all part of this technology, and Jim's this real tech nut, so he loves all this stuff, and so he and Andrew would kind of collude to do all these things. But it was like, we've got to build, we want to see the actors. It's got to be the actors underwater. And this kind of again goes to the abyss, because that's the actors doing all that stuff in the abyss. And they actually built custom made systems so that you could know it was the actors. The same with us, is we built these face masks so that you could see the actors' faces, and then you'd have lights inside the mask so you could light their faces. So it's for real, like it's the real deal. There's actually very few digital effects in the movie. There's a couple of, when we go wide in caverns and things, and we just didn't have, we would have shot it for real if we could, but we just didn't have the space and the time and the money. Much preferred to do it for real, but we couldn't. So, that all that stuff is very much driven by Jim. Using that tech and the, using robots underwater and the seeing those things. That underwater robot was, I think, Jim's, and they'd used that on the Ghost of the Abyss. The 2-camera rig was the rig that he'd used. Our underwater rig was the rig that he'd used on Ghost of the Abyss, and the Bismarck one, and the Aliens of the Deep. Because it was the only underwater rig that existed in the world, underwater 3D rig. And unfortunately, it didn't have that Pace Cameron technology. It was a side-by-side rig, which made its own sort of complications. But yeah, and then so when we were shooting that material, that's when Jim came. So by then, Avatar had been out for a couple of months, and he was sort of on the Australian leg of the promotion tour. And that was pretty wild. Like, that was fun, because that was my first kind of real, you're not in Kansas anymore, Toto kind of experiences, with Jim and the kind of press and the way all that stuff kind of worked, and being exposed to that world. And it's sort of funny. I mean, as I'm sure you know, like, making movies is actually a pretty boring and tedious process. Not from the director's point of view or the filmmaker's point of view. You're so kind of focused in on what you're doing. It's really intense, and you're just constantly, from a director's point of view, you're just constantly on the move, either mentally or physically or both usually. But from an outsider's point of view, you turn up and you look around, and it's like watching road workers. Like, no one appears to be doing anything. Everyone's standing around. You know what I mean? Holding paddle pops, what they're called. And that's what it kind of looks like. So Jim came and sort of, we're doing a mix of publicity. I'm still trying to make the movie, and I'm trying to talk to him. I'm incredibly intimidated. I look back at it, I still would be. It's very intimidating. Working for him because he's such a perfectionist, and you want him to be happy. You want Daddy to be happy, and all that stuff. So, and I'm sure each movie is different, and this was that movie at that time. And I think he did a Bigelow film, didn't he? And he's done a couple. He hasn't done many that he's been sort of executive producers on. A couple of documentaries.
Do you know what his when the film came out and the reception to the film, do you know what his view of the film is? Do you know, does he like it? Is he sort of like, I kind of wish it turned out to be something else?
I don't think I would ever know. He might tell me the truth nowadays, because enough water's come under the bridge. I mean, when we were in the kind of post-parts and shooting and editing, I was kind of cocooned in a lot of ways from what was happening at that executive producer level, and the discussions that they were having, good and bad. I think on the one hand, he was probably, it's like, oh God, if I was making this movie, I'd never do that. I would have done it like this. And, I imagine that's sort of inevitable. I think he kind of knew enough about the complexities of the shoot that he probably respected what we'd done to just do it, Was it the movie he wanted to be? I have no idea. I think he was probably a little disappointed. I mean, that's a guy who's used to having his name associated with projects that go blockbuster. and it wasn't that. But at the same time, it was never going to be that. That was never what its sort of mission was. I mean, it'd be nice if it made $1 billion, but it was never kind of intended to do that. I think the writing was on the wall once it was sort of revealed what the release weekend was going to be in North America. There's only so much you could do in it, and it goes to their just inability to know how to sell it. I mean, they did their best. There was a fairly, I think, a fairly significant P&A on it for what it was. Probably much bigger than it probably might have normally got. And Jim went all in trying to sell the thing. I mean, he did a dive with sharks somewhere. I remember, I think I was flying out of LA at the time or something, and he was doing some crazy stunt like that. That was like on the day of the release, the opening night, I think on the Friday or something. He was diving with sharks to advertise the film. I did a dive with sharks with Andrew in Melbourne as part of a marketing promotion, which had nothing to do with anything. There's no sharks in the movie. It was sort of like, it just seemed like a really, I don't know, silly, like a publicity hungry thing to do, and it kind of worked to a degree.
Was it the movie you wanted it to be?
Oh, yeah, yes and no. I mean, so stressful making that movie. I mean, it was so hard, and I'd only that was only my second movie I've made. As I said, I'd made my war movie beforehand, and that was difficult in its own way because we shot all on location, all in a jungle, 35mm film, and that has its own limitations and things, and only with a $3 million budget. So I went from a $3 million budget to a $30 million budget, and which doesn't feel like a $30 million film when you're making it. I can tell you, you're still going through the same stuff. It's just that it's sort of, you look around you and there's more people standing behind you, kind of thing. But it's the same kind of, it's the same experience. And part of the film is, it's very hard for me to watch now because I see the struggle. I don't see the movie. I just see the battle that it was every day. And Andrew, who's passed away, I'm not going to speak ill of him, and I loved him like a brother, and it's very emotional for me to think about it. He died in a helicopter crash making that movie with Jim, but he's a hard man. He's a difficult man, and he'd been trained by a hard man. Jim's a hard taskmaster, and he's not afraid to tell you to pull your head in, and shut up and do it like this, and he'll tear strips off you publicly if he thinks that's the thing that's going to motivate you. And Andrew was very much of a similar frame, and just because trying to squeeze every last drop of life out of what you've got, because what they know is it's the nature of filmmaking is you're only there right now at that moment for that minute, and then tomorrow's another day, and you've lost yesterday, and time's running out. Time is running out. And money's running out, and so you've got to squeeze every drop out of it and try to, and that's a 24/7 thing, for years, and it almost killed me, and it did actually kill a couple of our guys in the end. Our lead diver died in a cave about 3 months after the film was released. Agnes, our lead female stunt diver. Yeah, I can't remember what the question was, but there we go.
No, you're good. You're good. I noticed towards the end you've been kind of patchy again. I don't know if it's because of your phone or, but what I do want to do is I kind of want to wind down here. We've definitely covered quite a bit of this movie, so I'm very, very thrilled about that. And but you are a new guest on the podcast, which means that you get the same question that everyone gets at the end of each episode, which is, what is your favorite Cameron film? Putting aside your association to Cameron.
I mean, it has to be Terminator. God, so like you can't sort of think of the 80s and not think of some movies, and Terminator would be one of them. Like it's defining culturally what the world kind of was. The impact of that's just extraordinary.
Well, I definitely would love to continue talking to you, but we, I think, are getting a sign that we should probably wrap it up here because you've been really patchy towards the end there. But I'll edit all around it, so it'll look good. But look, I just want to say thank you for coming on here, really dedicating a few hours of your time to celebrating your film and giving us some really interesting, juicy behind the scenes stuff that I don't know if it's out there or not, but it's been a real treat to kind of just listen to you and hear the process. So thank you for coming on here. And any final words, and then we're gonna wrap it up here.
No, thank you. It's been wonderful to talk. Apologies for I can go on a bit. Have a look at Sanctum if you're interested, guys. I hope you enjoy it. I think it's a. We weren't as popular when we released. We released at a bad time. I think it's a better film than some of the coverage that we got. It's a journey. I hope you enjoy it. I think if you're a Cameron aficionado, you'll see a lot of James Cameron in the picture. Particularly if you know some of the behind the scenes stuff about it. But of course, it's not a James Cameron picture. It was him, the godfather, I suppose, of the movie. So, I hope you get a chance to look at it. I hope you enjoy it. And nice to meet you. Thank you so much. And good luck. Look forward to hearing the podcast.
Yes. All right, we'll wrap it up here. Everybody, thank you. Yes, do what Alister said. If you haven't checked out Sanctum, check it out. Obviously, it's available on physical, but you can also stream it. It's available to rent, and go support the film. All right, everybody, I'll be back very soon. And until that time, go watch a Cameron film.